Modern preppers stock knives, radios, and freeze-dried meals. But in the ruins of Europe, survival was quieter. In the bitter winters of 1943, a wool blanket wrapped around buried jars of lard did more than any tactical vest. Farmers didn't own bug-out bags. They built cold cellars by hand and sealed root vegetables in ash. Mothers didn't rely on purifiers. They filtered river water through cloth, gravel, and patience. What worked wasn't gear. It was memory, fragments of method passed down through famine, war, and silence. While today's prepping sells equipment, real survival was built from soot, urine, soil, and the human instinct to endure without being seen. Across Russia, France, and the Balkans, families survived occupation not through confrontation, but through concealment. Not by fighting the system, but by vanishing from it. One cache, one root cellar, one ash trench at a time. We think survival is about stockpiling, but those who truly endured didn't prepare to fight. They prepared to remain. You're about to rediscover 11 forgotten tricks that quietly outlasted history's worst collapse. Hit like and subscribe to rediscover the skills our ancestors never wanted us to forget. Number 1. The earth cellar method. In the frozen plains of Eastern Europe, a refrigerator was not an appliance. It was a hole in the ground, dug deep, lined with stone, and sealed with silence. In rural Poland, Ukraine, and parts of Hungary, entire families survived winter not with electricity, but with earth cellars built by instinct and inheritance. These were not just storage pits. They were life chambers, carved beneath the frost line where the soil kept steady at just above freezing, regardless of the storm above. Modern prepping relies on chest freezers and backup generators. But in 1944, those in the countryside had no such illusions. They chose locations carefully, on the north side of a hill, shaded from the sun. They dug deep enough to escape the cold, but not so deep that moisture would rot their stores. The walls were lined with river stone, or timber. The floors are packed with dry sand. Straw was used to insulate crates of potatoes, carrots, and jars of preserved fat. A vent tunnel allowed stale air to rise and fresh air to circulate slowly, keeping rot and mold at bay. In Hungary, it was common to hang beets from rafters by string, so they wouldn't touch damp surfaces. In Ukraine, large families would build hidden trapdoor entries in barns, so the cellars wouldn't be raided by soldiers. These chambers were dark, cool, and quiet, perfect conditions for life without spoilage. There was no thermostat, only judgment. Each layer of straw was placed with care. Each root vegetable is checked by hand. In many villages, children were taught to listen for the sound of dripping water or shifting air as a warning sign. They weren't just storing food, they were preserving their odds of making it to spring. It wasn't technology. It was a pact with the earth. This wasn't just survival. It was memory, passed down in silence. Number 2. Ash and waste trench fertilizers. In wartime Britain, a garden wasn't just a source of food, it was a declaration of independence. But the soil, tired from centuries of overuse and stripped of industrial fertilizers, had nothing left to give. The solution came from beneath the stove and behind the outhouse. Across the countryside, families began digging narrow trenches between rows of crops. Into these they layered what modern minds discard: fireplace ash, potato peels, spoiled soup, even human waste. Each layer was a silent formula, a calculation not of chemistry, but of desperation and observation. Wood ash added potassium and raised pH in acidic soils. Human waste, when left to decompose properly in dry conditions, added nitrogen and phosphorus. Soot, hair, broken eggshells, and animal bones were all fed into these trenches like sacred offerings to the earth. The Dig for Victory campaign encouraged citizens to turn every patch of land into food. But officials rarely spoke aloud what civilians knew instinctively. If you had no fertilizer, you made it. In Scotland, gardeners collected soot from chimneys and spread it beneath cabbage leaves. In Wales, dry latrines were harvested with lime to create compost, safe for non-root crops. Even urine diluted with water became a quick-acting nitrogen booster in struggling gardens. This was not done carelessly. There were rules, passed down by those who had no room for error. Waste had to be aged. Ash had to be dry. Trenches had to be marked. It wasn't guesswork. It was precision, masked in mud. Children were taught to stir the compost pile with sticks, not hands. Grandmothers kept separate tins for crushed bones. Nothing edible went to waste, but nothing inedible was wasted either. They built fertility from decay, harvest from hardship. Today's preppers rely on synthetic fertilizers and sealed containers. But in 1942, what came from the fire and the body returned to the soil in cycles as old as time. There was no shame in it, only strategy. It's a method modern prepping still hasn't reclaimed. Number 3, the seed hiding rituals. In occupied France, a seed was more dangerous than a bullet, and far more valuable. When German forces seized farms and rationed food to submission, many civilians turned to the last thing they truly owned, their seeds. Not for trade, not for sale, but for tomorrow. Heirloom seeds were passed from grandmother to daughter, like family jewelry. Each one a memory of a previous harvest, a flavor remembered, a color no longer seen in the markets. But under occupation, keeping seeds was seen as resistance. Authorities knew. Whoever controlled the next planting controlled the people. So, women adapted. Seeds were dried in attic rafters behind loose bricks. Tiny pouches were sewn into hems of dresses or stitched beneath collars of infant clothing, hidden in plain sight. In Yugoslav villages, children carried walnut shells filled with seeds, glued shut and disguised as toys. In Bohemia, seed jars were buried in animal pens where soldiers were least likely to search. Modern prepping focuses on bulk seed vaults and refrigerated safes, but during war, survival meant protecting seed not just from weather, but from theft, suspicion, and fire. The drying process was simple but sacred. Seeds were laid on linen under shade, never in direct sun. Each variety kept apart, labeled by hand. If paper was scarce, symbols were scratched into bark or bone. Once dry, they were sealed in waxed tins or glass jars and hidden inside flour sacks or beneath floorboards. In one Czech town, widows who had lost sons to the front met weekly under the guise of prayer. But what passed between them were not just condolences, they were seeds. Wrapped in cloth, exchanged in silence, they kept entire food lines alive when the next planting came. This wasn't about gardening, this was about outlasting. About slipping life past the eyes of an occupying force that measured power in scarcity. They didn't store it for convenience. They stored for defiance. One forgotten skill, one more day alive. Number 4, cloth and charcoal water filtration. When the taps ran dry in Leningrad, thirst didn't wait. Bombs shattered pipelines. Wells froze over, and those who drank unfiltered snow or gutter runoff quickly fell to dysentery. But some families endured, not with chemicals, not with tablets, but with cloth, charcoal, and memory. In the absence of sanitation, they built their own filters. Layered buckets. The first lined with linen or wool to catch silt. Below that, a layer of clean sand. Beneath that, crushed charcoal from burned birch or pine. And at the bottom, pebbles, broken pottery, or even shards of brick to slow the flow. Modern filters boast micron ratings and pump speeds. But these wartime devices, built from scavenged ruin, saved lives by harnessing what every village elder already knew. That charcoal binds toxins, that sand slows bacteria, that patience purifies. In rural Serbia, children were taught to boil water first, then filter it cold. In parts of Belarus, entire neighborhoods shared a single filtration barrel. The cloth was changed daily, washed in boiled water, then left to dry over the stove. Every step was deliberate. Every mistake carried risk. Charcoal was prized. Not just any blackened wood would do. It had to be cooled slowly, never doused, so that its structure remained porous. Families who had forgotten the old methods learned quickly from those who hadn't. Those who waited for help often died. Those who remembered stayed alive. In some households, small signs were posted, chalked or etched into door frames, noting which filter had been changed, which water had cooled. These weren't luxury systems. They were rituals of survival, passed down by grandparents who remembered the last famine, the last flood, the last fire. Even today, few understand how powerful such a method remains. No batteries, no cartridges, just layers, cloth, sand, charcoal, stone, and the discipline to wait. They didn't filter to improve taste, they filtered to bury death. Tech fails, but this method never did. Number 5. Natural pest control from waste. In 1941, the cabbage fields of Austria weren't attacked by bombs. They were devoured by beetles. Wartime rationing meant pesticides were redirected to the front lines. Civilians were left with rot, ruin, and insects that threatened what little food they had left. But instead of surrendering their harvest, farmers turned to what no one wanted: soot, urine, and the bitter science of desperation. Across the German countryside, soot from chimney flues was collected each morning before the hearth cooled. Fine and dark, it was dusted over leafy vegetables like a protective ash veil. The black powder clung to dew and confused the scent trails of insects. Slugs avoided it, aphids died from contact. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. In Latvia and rural parts of Prussia, diluted urine was used not just to fertilize, but to defend. Collected in pots, aged a few days, and then mixed with water, 1 part urine to 10 parts water. It was poured around root crops in the early morning. The ammonia repelled pests. The nitrogen fed the soil. Nothing went to waste. Today, prepping shelves overflow with synthetic sprays and chemical formulas. But in wartime Europe, every solution had to come from the land or from the body. Hair clippings were scattered between rows to repel deer. Crushed eggshells were lined around garden edges to cut soft-bodied pests. Soap scraps dissolved in water created makeshift insecticide. None of it came from a factory. All of it came from necessity. In some villages, children were tasked with collecting soot from neighbors' chimneys. Elderly women taught how to apply it sparingly, whispering cautions. Too much would burn the leaves. In others, urine collection was discreet, shared between trusted households, labeled in jars hidden in root cellars. This wasn't improvisation. It was an adaptation refined through hunger. Every plant was a chance at another week of survival. Every pest defeated meant a dinner saved, and every trick passed on meant the next row might live. It wasn't convenient. This was a necessity wrapped in dust and silence. One forgotten skill, one more day alive. Number 6. Graveyard food caches. In the forests of eastern Poland and western Ukraine, there was one place soldiers rarely searched: graveyards. Not out of mercy, but out of fear. Superstition still held its grip, even in war. And so, when pantries were raided and barns were burned, families buried their survival where no one dared disturb the soil of the dead. These weren't symbolic gestures. They were strategic. Earthen jars sealed with wax and wrapped in cloth were lowered into freshly dug false graves, often near real ones, marked with wooden crosses or old stones. Dried beans, salt, lard, flour, even cured meat, nothing that would spoil quickly. Everything that could mean another month alive. In Ukrainian villages, it was common for women to carry baskets draped with cloth, appearing to mourn. Beneath the cloth, food sealed in oilskin. They moved silently between the trees, placing goods in marked spots near overgrown plots. The headstones served as memory maps. Some even carved discrete codes into wood to mark what lay beneath. Modern prepping teaches to cache supplies in forests or underground bunkers. But these civilians used culture itself as their camouflage. Graves weren't sacred, they were safe. Raiders feared curses. Soldiers avoided the dead. And so families survived by hiding life among the symbols of death. These caches were built for silence. No metal, no shine. Clay jars wrapped in wool, no markers beyond what memory could hold. In some cases, wax was mixed with charcoal to make the seal blend with the earth. Children were told bedtime stories that secretly mapped the burial spots, songs and rhymes that encoded location through rhythm and repetition. But even this had its risks. Dig too deep and you hit water. Too shallow and frost would crack the jars. It took precision and bravery, because if discovered, it wasn't just confiscation, it was punishment. Still, they were buried, quietly, repeatedly, not out of fear, but out of love for those who might return hungry. It wasn't survival, it was defiance in silence. This wasn't just survival, it was memory, passed down in silence. Number 7. The silent signal codes. Radios were powerful, but they were also a trap. In Nazi-occupied Norway, every civilian who owned a radio was required to register it. Signals could be traced. Unauthorized transmissions meant arrest, or worse. Yet, communication was essential. For partisans hiding in the mountains, and for families waiting for news, silence had to speak. So, they found a different language. Cloth strips tied to trees, white for safe passage, red for danger. A blue strip fluttering meant supplies were buried nearby. In some areas, small stone stacks were built at trailheads. 3 flat stones balanced vertically meant someone passed safely. A 4th, laid across the top, meant don't follow. In villages along the fjords, laundry lines told more than they dried. A red scarf pinned beside a white blouse signaled that soldiers had left. A missing clothespin meant to wait another day. These weren't codes invented in books. They were born from necessity, evolving quietly in kitchens and barns. Modern prepping favors encrypted radios and satellite phones, but during occupation, anything that emitted a signal could betray. So they turned to absence, to gesture, to shape and rhythm. In partisan-held forests, even bird calls were mimicked. 3 short chirps, a pause, then 2. Anyone who didn't respond with the same knew to stay hidden. Children were taught to stack firewood in certain shapes. Upright if the house had food, sideways if it had been searched. Nothing written, nothing loud. In Denmark, a string tied on the left gatepost meant the night was safe. Tied on the right, it wasn't. Farmers placed pitchforks facing out when danger approaches. Facing inwardly, all was calm. The entire countryside became a message board that only the desperate could read. These codes required no batteries, only memory, only trust. And when the war ended, many of them vanished, erased like chalk from a wall. But for those who survived, they remained etched deeper than ink, not as tools of war, but as whispers of how silence could save. They didn't just hide, they spoke in the shadows. There was no plan B, only adaptation. Now you know why WWII survival wasn't about gadgets, it was about grit. The techniques that kept families alive in the most brutal winters and under the most ruthless regimes weren't modern, sleek, or bought in stores. They were built from ash, memory, and silence. There were no survival kits, no tactical backpacks, only human instinct, passed down through hand and soil. In every region touched by war, people returned to the land. Not out of ideology, but because the earth was the only thing left that didn't lie. Cold cellars dug with shovels, compost piles made from soot and waste, jars buried in graveyards. Nothing came easy, and nothing was certain. But every technique carried the same message. What's old is not outdated, it's undefeated. What they lacked in technology, they made up for in tenacity. And in many cases, what they built outlasted even the war itself. The food cellars are still there, under crumbling barns. The filtering barrels now rot in forgotten courtyards. But the knowledge remains, if you choose to carry it. Today, in a world bursting with tools and trends, it's easy to forget the lessons of those who survived without them. But gear breaks, batteries die, and plans fail. What doesn't fail is a method tested by fire, famine, and time. These weren't preppers, they were protectors of soil, of seed, of memory. Every skill you've just seen was used not once, but across generations, adapted, refined, and whispered through war. They were quiet methods, but they screamed of resilience. So next time someone shows off their gear, ask what they'd do without it. Then remember what our ancestors did, with nothing. In a world without light, they still found a way to grow. One subscription helps revive the knowledge they died to preserve.